Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers the Long War, what we call the Long War. It's the global war on terror, and we're expanding that to include issues like Russian aggression in Ukraine and other areas. Today, we are going to do a battlefield update on the situation in Ukraine, and Russians' recent withdrawal from Kherson will definitely play a key theme to this podcast. Also, we're going to look at Russian actions on the Donbass front and Russian attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, and then we'll try and take a look at what lies ahead in the next couple of months. Always difficult to do in this war, but we'll give it a go. Today's guest is John Hardie. He's the deputy director of FDD's Russia program. John looks at the detail of this war like Tom Jocelyn and I have looked at the details of the war on terror. He has great insights on what is happening day to day and has done a really good job of looking forward. John, welcome to Generation Jihad. It's great to have you back on.
Hey, Bill. Great to be back.
Let's get right to it. It's a lot has happened since you were last on the program. I believe it was in the beginning of October.
That's right.
Yeah, it's really stunning what's happened. You had the offensive in Kharkiv we've had, which we discussed back then. With the Ukrainians driving the Russians out from there. Now they've pivoted to Kherson in the south, and they've retaken the city of Kherson after General Sergei Surovikin. He's the commander of Russian forces in Ukraine, and he ordered the withdrawal of all Russian forces across the Dnipro River that ceded the city of Kherson to the Ukrainians. Keep in mind, Kherson was an area or one of the four regions that was annexed by Russia within the last 2 months. But unlike Kharkiv, the withdrawal from Kherson appeared orderly. I think this was significant for all the downsides of what happens to the Russians. This might be the only bright spot, and we'll get into that a little bit soon. But first, John, why did Russia withdraw its forces from Kherson? What was happening there that forced the Russians to pull? I believe it was about 20 to 30,000 Russian troops across the Dnipro River that were stationed there.
That's the number we've gotten consistently. And I think actually over the past month or so, it may have even increased a tad as they brought in some mobilized troops to try to cover the withdrawal. But essentially, I think it was just a recognition that Russia's position there on the western bank of the Dnipro River was just increasingly untenable because of Ukraine's months-long strategy of corrosion, targeting using HIMARS and other long-range strike systems to target several key bridges across the Dnipro River and then another river on the west bank. So that combined with targeting command and control and what have you, it really just left the Russians in a tough spot. And I think the new commander essentially convinced Putin it was time to withdraw, and Putin had resisted that for a while. For obvious political reasons. And I think he also, really valued that foothold on the western bank of the river, perhaps hoping for a renewed offensive maybe in 2023, targeting Mykolaiv and Odessa. But I think, its generals, chief among them, the new commander, probably convinced him, otherwise.
I think it's safe to say that targeting Mykolaiv and Odessa is off the table for at least a year or two now, if not ever. I think the Russian dream of taking the entirety of the Black Sea coast has to have gone down in flames.
Absolutely. If you look at the beginning of the war, when they initially took the western bank of Kherson, it was actually a pretty impressive feat to have crossed to cross the river as easily as they did, and it was actually a big controversy in Ukraine. Why were they able to do that so quickly? I don't think they'll be as successful the second time around.
The Ukrainians, I remember reading, they were taking a real beating in that area. They weren't prepared.
They were undermanned. Yeah, there might have been some issues with, let's just say, penetration by Russian intelligence. At least that's the implication you get from firing certain people, after the fact.
Yeah. But they did do some things right there when I remember they were destroying the bridges into Mykolaiv, and so they fought the Ukrainians. They fought a pretty intelligent, a skilled defensive war against the Russians. I would say throughout they've sacrificed what they've needed to sacrifice in order to hold on and go back on the defensive. But let's take a look at the new commander, Surovkin. He played a key role in the decision to withdraw, or so it seems, right? How did he get Putin's ear? He and others get Putin's ear to withdraw?
Sure. So how exactly did it? I can't exactly say, but it does just seem, from the fact that, a few weeks ago, very shortly after his formal appointment as the overall commander, he, gave an interview. The first time, for much of this war, Russia hasn't had an overall commander, so there's no commander to give an interview. But he gave one. First time a commander has done that so far, and he alluded to the fact that Russia might have to withdraw. So I think we sort of saw the writing on the wall. I think the Russians have been laying the groundwork for a potential withdrawal, both in their propaganda and in military actions. For some time now. To me, it was sort of unclear whether they would actually cede the Western Bank without a fight. I think Putin was probably reluctant to do so, but evidently the generals convinced him. If you don't, you risk leaving. Like the bulk of what's left of the professional Russian military, which had been on the Western Bank, you risk having them encircled and cut off. So I think they did the military prudent thing. Perhaps a little bit belatedly, but ultimately Putin has proven that when push comes to shove, whether it's Kharkiv or Kyiv or now Kherson, he will eventually withdraw if forced to confront reality. It's actually a bit ironic that leaving out the route in Kharkiv, and that disorderly retreat there, the retreats from around Kyiv and then now Kherson have been some of the better organized, at least it seems like have been some of the better organized Russian operations of this entire war. So take that for what you will.
Yeah, good at retreating. Yeah, let's get into that a little bit more. What does the orderly withdrawal from Kherson tell us about the Russian military going forward? Are the generals and political leaders, are they learning from their past mistakes? I mean, I realize, this is learning from losing, but there is value in that, that they start making the right decisions, going forward. That always is a cause, probably should be a cause for concern from Ukraine if they're starting to think rationally about their military situation.
Yeah, so I'd say the generals from the very beginning probably weren't the main problem. They're definitely, this war has exposed a lot of problems within Russia's military, so I don't want to, just say they're blameless for what's been a debacle of a war, but at least if you want to believe public reporting based on U.S. intelligence, the generals were warning Putin from the very beginning. This military plan that you and the FSB seem to have drawn up, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We're going to need a lot more troops. But the plan, of course, was based on Putin and the FSB's sort of flawed assumptions about Ukraine and its ability and will to resist, and perhaps a bit of wishful thinking about the Russian military. And so from the very beginning, I don't think the generals were the chief problem. And once Putin, I think, stepped back a little bit after the initial Kyiv campaign and sort of let the generals run the show in the Donbass, Russia's military had taken a beating, so it wasn't really pretty, but it did have a little bit more military coherence. But now that the new commander's taken over, you have some unity of command. So that's probably helped things a bit as well.
Tell us about conducting a retrograde or a retreat, whatever you wanted to call it. What does this retreat itself, what does it tell us about Russian capabilities? Like you said, in Kharkiv, it was an absolute shit show, dare I say. But this retreat was definitely, I would describe it as orderly. Not a lot of equipment left behind. They got their people out. We're not seeing a lot of captive Russian soldiers. I don't recall seeing any. But yeah, tell us a little bit more about the capabilities there of the Russian military with this withdrawal.
Sure. So unlike in Kharkiv, I think the Russians had prepared for this retreat for a while. So they had set up pre-prepared defensive lines to fall back to. actually in this sector of the war of the battlefield, they had high force density, whereas it was the opposite in Kharkiv. So for months now, it's been a pretty tough slog for Ukraine. Ukraine itself has taken significant casualties. So the Ukrainians just weren't in a position to rout the Russians like they were in Kharkiv. So as the Russians were retreating, it seems like they brought in some additional forces to cover, and then slowly withdrew back to pre-prepared defensive positions before ultimately retrograding across the river. Definitely, it doesn't seem like an easy operation. Those type of things never are, especially when you have to cross a river like that over some degraded bridges. But they seem to have pulled it off. Like you're saying, I haven't seen a whole lot of open source evidence of a ton of vehicles left behind. There have been some. I think in most cases they've destroyed things they couldn't fix and take back. So the losses appear to be minimal. If that had not been the case, and we had another Kharkiv, a lot of Russian troops and some of their best ones they have left would have probably lost their combat capability. So that truly would have been a disaster.
Yeah, absolutely would have been a disaster. So what is the political impact of the withdrawal from Kherson on Putin? Obviously, this is yet another in the latest line of defeats. But what do we think? Where does Putin go from here?
I think, to me, he's probably thinking, okay, I'm mobilizing. I'm putting my full effort into this war. I don't think he'll be happy with just where he is now, especially having lost a considerable amount of territory that, remember, in his eyes is now Russian. So I would imagine he wants to renew offensive operations in 2023. So, some sort of renewed counter offensive. Where exactly that happens, I'm not sure. For now, Ukraine really retains the strategic initiative, so they're able to dictate where and when those major battles happen. But I'm sure Putin would like to use mobilization, to get back on the offensive.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost insane if he thinks that he's going to go back on the offensive and retake ground at this point. He's ground down some of his best forces, and really he's on the defensive. I mean, I think if you look at this, Putin would be lucky to be able to consolidate and hold what it currently holds right now.
Yeah, I think that was the big challenge for Russia before mobilization, which I think is exactly why they did it. Putin, he may not have a great appreciation for exactly what makes a combat capable unit, or perhaps he still thinks in like kind of World War I mentality, where you just get a bunch of people and mass is all that matters, and throwing cannon fodder into the fight is really enough. But I'd say on both sides you have right now force regeneration is a priority. For Ukrainians, they really they need to train and equip additional forces to retain, and then you continue to push the strategic initiative. So getting more Western equipment is a priority. We can talk about that later. But same thing obviously for the Russians. They need to continue with mobilization and try to reconstitute some of the force. So I suspect that's the priority for Putin.
What does the future look like on the Kherson front? I hate to ask those questions, but I think we have a lot. This war is 9 months in. I think we have a lot of data to look at and be able to give some type of intelligent prognostication here. Can the Ukrainians capitalize and move forward in Kherson, or do we think things will stabilize there?
I'd imagine that obviously the Russians are going to try to consolidate their new defensive line on the eastern bank of the Dnieper. They were building those lines already, but before the withdrawal. The Ukrainians, I think, would be pretty hard pressed to conduct a successful river crossing operation there. I think both sides will probably redeploy some forces from that area to other fronts. Zaporizhia, to me, seems like a prime one. The Ukrainians have already been moving in some troops, at least based on reports from Russian observers. Both sides might try to reinforce the Bakhmut area. maybe the Luhansk Oblast area where Ukraine is trying to push. So I think neither side is really want for another sector that needs reinforcing, either because the Russian side is being threatened, or in Ukraine's case around Bakhmut, maybe that's a little threatened for them.
Okay, let's take a look at the Donbass region now, where the fighting is ongoing, but that front does seem to have stabilized. Would you agree with that assessment?
So I don't think we're going to see dramatic swings, at least not in the Bakhmut and then Vuhledar area, which we can talk about. The area up near Kreminna and Svatovia.
Yeah, let's start with the Kreminna area. So there's basically, we're going to talk about three areas there. Let's start on that Kreminna area, and then we'll move on to Vuhledar and Bakhmut.
I think if we're going to see dramatic gains on the Ukrainian side, that's probably where it'll happen. If you remember, after the Kharkiv counteroffensive, basically the Russians tried to organize a new defensive line in the Oskil River. The Ukrainians were able to cross it in multiple places, and then eventually take Liman. The Russians had to keep falling back until now they're basically trying to hold their defensive line. Between those two small towns I mentioned, both not very big, but strategically important, or operationally important. So they're trying to hold that line. The lines haven't moved a ton in the past month or so since we last spoke, and that's really where we are now. The Ukrainians conduct daily attacks there, but haven't made a ton of ground in the past month. Honestly, I'm not quite sure whether they have concentrated there sufficient forces for another operational level counteroffensive. I'd imagine the fight really across the battlefield has taken a good bit out of them over the past couple months, in both men and materiel. So it's possible they need to kind of regroup, refit, get some more Western equipment accumulated, and then prepare something. Perhaps it's 2023, although I wouldn't rule out a continuation of the counteroffensive over the winter.
Do you think the Ukrainians could have success during a winter offensive in this region?
They could. It'll be tougher. I mean, so offensive maneuver might will be tough in the mud as it currently is. And then once the ground freezes, that won't be as much of a problem. But they'll have to deal with things you might not think about, like reduction in foliage. So it may you can't use the foliage for cover. That can make offensive operations difficult. The cold in general can be tough on both sides, but the Ukrainians, I think, know how to fight in the cold, and for that matter, so do the Russians. Although I think the cold probably will, kind of exacerbate Ukraine's advantage in morale, just because cold is never nice. You have Ukrainians with more determination, and then on the Russian side, you have probably a lot of mobilized troops who may have not gotten their cold weather gear. So that could be tough for them.
The Russians in the East, particularly in the Donbass region, seem to have a significant advantage in artillery. Has this been negated with the Western artillery systems that have come in, like the GLMRS and the HIMARS, things of that nature? We heard a lot about that in the Russian offensive in the Donbass over the summer, where the Ukrainians were saying, we're outgunned 10-1, and that seems to have dried up. What has happened to the Russian artillery advantage? Do you have any indication of anything happening with that?
Anecdotal evidence over the past few months has sort of gone both ways. I think it's depended on where exactly we were in the war. So, for example, right after the Kharkiv counteroffensive, I think the artillery rates probably dropped off, as you might expect, because the Russians were reorganizing. They left probably a lot of shells behind. We saw some on video evidence, probably some we didn't see. But overall, I think the numbers that I've heard from Ukrainian and U.S. sources about Russian and Ukrainian daily rates of artillery fire across the entire battlefield have actually remained remarkably similar. So assuming those numbers I'm hearing are correct, it sounds like the Russians might have done a better job than I anticipated of sort of adjusting to the HIMARS threat, dispersing depots, things of that nature.
Okay. This has been one that's really bothered me. I would have thought that artillery advantage would have helped the Russians, particularly on the defensive. But, I guess this all remains to be seen. And as you note, you've said numerous times, it depends. It goes by theater right?
And then to be clear, when I mean the numbers stay the same. So Russia still does have, at least based on these numbers, again, a considerable advantage in daily rate of fire. But right. I'm hearing 15 to 20,000 shells per day versus a few thousand for the Ukrainians. What the Ukrainians have is a considerable advantage in precision, both because of HIMARS and MLRS, but also because their tube artillery, I think, is a good bit more accurate than the average Russian counterpart.
And these would be the Western supplied tube artillery, correct?
Exactly.
All right, let's take a look at the Volodar front, or what's going on there. Sure.
In late October, Russia launched a tactical offensive to take a town, Donetsk Oblast, called Pavlivka, which Russia had took early in the war, but then lost over the summer. The goal is likely to go there from Pavlivka to Volodar, which is just to the north. I think basically what the Russians are trying to do here is to push the Ukrainians back from a key rail hub further down south. It also helped the Russians make some gains slightly to the northeast, where they're trying to push the Ukrainians back from Donetsk city. So basically some Russian naval infantry, along with perhaps some volunteer forces, maybe some mobilized troops, and probably some DNR as well. It seemed to have entered Pavlivka and taken some heavy casualties in the process. There was actually an incident where some of the naval infantry troops released a letter basically complaining about taking heavy casualties for an offensive that in their mind didn't really make a whole lot of sense. So it's sort of an information op coup for the Ukrainians, which they've exploited.
So this is one of the areas where the Russians nominally, I would say, are on the offensive.
They're definitely on the offensive. I'd say that it doesn't really seem like they have the prospects to turn this into tactical successes into operational ones. So I don't think that they're going to push like tens of kilometers. But if the goal is to move the Ukrainians slightly back from the rail hub I mentioned, then they could be successful in that.
I'm Bill Raggio. This is Generation Jihad, and today our guest is John Hardie. He is the Deputy Director of FDD's Russia program. We're talking the war in Ukraine and recent Ukrainian advances, as well as what's happening in the Donbas region. John, finally, we're going to get to the Bakhmut region. Tell us what's happening there, who's leading the fight, and what are Russians' prospects. I would also say this is probably an area where you could describe as Russia nominally being on the defensive. Tell us what you're seeing.
Sure. So it's sort of similar in the sense that Russia's made some fairly minor tactical advances, albeit at the cost of heavy casualties. In this sector, the Wagner Group, nominally private military company led by a Russian oligarch close to the Kremlin, is really leading the charge here, along with perhaps some soft and other Russian regulars. Also the local DNR proxy forces, which Russia's now annexed. But anyways, they're trying to block Bakhmut from the south and northeast, and I think eventually they probably want to push to a town west of Bakhmut and block the city from that direction as well. Theoretically, taking Bakhmut could open the door to the last two major cities in Donetsk Oblast. It sort of opened a window to lead up there to the northwest, but I just don't really see the prospects for that happening. Again, the Russians don't really seem to have the manpower or momentum to turn these tactical successes into operational gains. And in fact, some of the tactical successes they've had over the past month have been sort of reversed by Ukrainian counterattacks. So it's a hard slog on both sides. I'd say both sides are probably taking significant casualties, but on the whole, Ukraine is holding up. And if Ukraine ends up making significant gains in the Luhansk Oblast, in the sector we discussed earlier, any Russian gains around Bakhmut, could be nullified by Ukraine.
Yeah, we mentioned that on the last podcast that you would join, that Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, they seem to be out of reach for the Russians given the losses in Kharkiv. You have to wonder what the Russians are thinking, grinding down their forces by trying to make some small tactical advances.
I think it's sort of perhaps in the emotional thing. It's kind of totemic sector of the battlefield where you want to remain on the offensive. Taking the rest of Donetsk Oblast is a stated political goal, and also you might have a situation where like I said, Wagner's led by this oligarch Prigozhin, who is sort of trying to angle to increase his own clout within Russia. So there might not be total unity of command in that sector. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. We hear a lot about the Russian losses. Do we have indication that the Ukrainians are taking losses on the same scale as the Russians? That's the one thing about this war that's really bothered me, is that we get a lot of reporting on what the Russians are doing and aren't doing right and their casualties. And the Ukrainian, it seems like there's just an information blackout on what's happening in Ukraine. I believe was it General Milley, the chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff? Is that correct? He said that the Ukrainians, it pretty much indicated the Ukrainians took equal casualties as the Russians. And I thought that was significant, but who knows, right?
I did as well. And assuming, I think what he said was, Russia around 100,000, and Ukraine, about the same. So I'll give him, maybe some wiggle room there. Maybe he was thinking 80 or something. I don't know. But whatever it was, it is significant. It did strike me as well, because if you think back earlier to, the rare assessments we've got from Western leaders, intelligence leaders about Russian casualties and Ukrainian casualties, it was always, Ukraine significantly smaller than Russia, smaller number. So if they are, about even, that I guess that would mean Ukraine is taking a lot more over the past few months, perhaps as it's gone on the offensive. Offensive operations tend to require more troops, and you can lose more as well. So I know that the fighting in Kherson, for example, has been particularly tough, and Ukraine has taken significant casualties there. Perhaps that's been what's driving the increase.
Yeah. So the Russians have been targeting Ukrainian infrastructure in long-range strikes. The bulk of the targets appear to be things like power plants, power substations, some fuel depots, I think I've seen. Now we see many Ukrainian cities are experiencing power shortages and even blackouts. What's the Russian goals with these attacks? I think it's quite clear they want to make life difficult for the Ukrainians, trying to erode their will. Do you think this is going to work? And is Russia able to keep up this type of strikes? The lack of efficacy of their air force has been quite puzzling to me. What are your thoughts on that, John?
Sure. So when the new commander, Surovikin, came in, that's basically when this campaign started. If you remember, really the big first wave of strikes was right after Ukraine attacked the Crimean Bridge. But actually, I think they'd had it in the works, the plans in the works, for at least a week or two before that. Basically, like you said, they're trying to strike infrastructure, energy infrastructure primarily, trying to give Ukraine really a tough winter by knocking out their electricity supplies. I think that the goal is probably, like you said, to undermine Ukrainian will. If anything, I think it'll do the opposite. That being said, Ukraine does face a pretty tough challenge with these strikes. Russia's used these Iranian loitering munitions, the Shahed 131 and 136s. Ukraine's actually had a good bit of success shooting them down, but basically Russia, you're able to mask them because they're so cheap. So if you throw 10, then 7 get shot down, well, 3 still hit a substation or something. It can cause big problems, especially if Iran is able to continue producing and then providing them to Russia, which it seems to be able to do. These things are made with commercially available components. They're not very expensive, like I said, probably on the order of tens of thousands of dollars, as opposed to hundreds or even millions for an expensive missile. It does seem like Russia will be able to keep up this campaign of strikes. And one thing this does for Ukraine, in addition to taking out the electricity infrastructure, it also causes them a big problem in that to shoot these things down, oftentimes you have to expend a surface-to-air missile that's much more expensive than what you're shooting down. So, and in particular with the missiles for Ukraine's Soviet-made systems, the S-300 and the Buk M1s, and particularly the latter, I think that they probably face a shortage of surface-to-air missiles, and if they run out of those, that'll be a big problem. I don't think the West, although we've provided some additional air defense systems, I think will come. I'm not sure we'd be able to bridge that gap entirely, at least in the near to medium term. So that would be a big problem for Ukraine. And you mentioned the Russian Air Force. I definitely agree. It doesn't seem to have been very effective in this war. That being said, if Ukraine isn't able to contest the skies like it has been, because it doesn't have these long, medium range surface to air missile systems, that could allow the Russian Air Force to operate a bit more freely. They wouldn't have to fly as low, which wouldn't make them as vulnerable to manpads, and so they could see them unleashed to some extent. To exactly what extent, I'm not sure. Whether they'd actually be able to conduct some sort of strategic air campaign targeting bridges or whatever, or if it'd be more limited to perhaps a bit more effective close air support. I'm not quite sure. But if Ukraine does not get more air defenses to bridge the gap, I think that will be a big problem.
You hit on it, John. I think this is one of the long-term goals with these attacks on the civilian infrastructure. It puts a strain on Ukrainian air defense systems. And what we've seen, right, the Israelis, the Ukrainians have been pressing the Israelis to provide air defense systems and other systems. The Israelis are saying, we don't have enough for ourselves. And other countries which have skimped on their national defense for decades, particularly NATO countries that are supporting Ukraine, they have enough for themselves. They don't have an excess of this. Even the U.S. is running into these sort of problems. So I think this is something that bears looking at in the future. The Russians can, I think one thing, if I were the Russians, I'd want to do, I'd want to be able to hunt and target those HIMARS systems that have really caused problems for the Russians. As you mentioned, they're using them to target weapons depots, command and control centers, long-range bridges. And as you mentioned earlier, as the Russians press forward and are now on the west bank of the Dnipro, those HIMARS can be moved a little further forward to hit in further in the Russian rear area. If I'm the Russians, I want to degrade Ukrainian air defense systems enough that I could get my Air Force back into the fight, as well as have the advantage. And by the way, hitting the power systems, it's not just civilian targets to erode the morale. The Ukrainian military needs power. They need fuel. They need other, these things that the Russians are targeting. So there's also an impact there. But let's start looking ahead. Where do we see things going? We mentioned a little bit about the winter earlier, right? The winter is coming. The Russian military looks like they're digging in. The Ukrainians may be looking in some fronts to continue their offensive. It would make, if they have the capabilities of doing it. What do you see looking ahead where both Russia and Ukraine, where are they going with this war?
Sure. So I think there's a pretty wide expectation, definitely in the West, that we'll kind of see a lull in fighting in Ukraine. I think that's probably true to an extent for some of the reasons we mentioned earlier. That being said, I think if we're expecting this to sort of be a pause, that's probably misguided. The Ukrainian Zaluzhny, the top general, basically said as much yesterday. So I think this will remain a high intensity fight. Ukraine will continue to try to, exploit advantages in morale, range, precision, intelligence, their interior lines, and training will, I think, increasingly be in Ukraine's favor as Russia has to rely more and more on relatively untrained troops. Well, I think Ukrainian mobilized forces are probably getting better training, in part thanks to Western training programs, which are continuing to ramp up.
Real quick, John, how many troops are being trained monthly?
When the UK first launched their program, the goal was like 10,000 over 3 months. I think they've since expanded it, and they're also, in addition to sort of like just basic training, I think they're doing a little bit more like training of junior commanders, a little bit more unit training. And then the EU recently launched a new program. I'm not sure exactly where they'll end up with capacity. But I think bottom line is, these Ukrainian mobilized forces are getting probably significantly better training than what they're getting in Russia.
And what is the Russian goals over the winter? What do you think? What do you see happening?
Sure. So I think much like Ukraine, Russia needs to generate additional forces. They're going to do that through mobilization. They'll be taking some more equipment out of storage, trying to procure more arms from Iran, probably North Korea as well. So I think Russia wants to be able to emerge from the winter with sort of a reconstituted force and then win back the strategic initiative, while Ukraine, of course, wants to prevent Russia from sort of regaining the initiative and its cohesion and morale, and wants to continue to press its initiative. Like I said, force generation will be a priority for both sides. Ukraine obviously needs continued flows of Western equipment. We mentioned air defense, but protected mobility, armored vehicles, tanks, etc. These things are definitely important as well. In addition to the continued flows of artillery and munitions and what have you.
Is it fair to say that Ukraine is becoming increasingly dependent on Western weapon systems as it depletes its stockpiles of its Soviet systems?
Oh, certainly. I mean, so there was actually a heartening report the other day that Ukraine is going to organize some production of Soviet-made or Soviet standard artillery shells. That being said, I couldn't see them having being able to organize production that quickly of sufficient capacity to sustain what they need, especially if they're going to move toward some sort of parity in artillery fires. So they'll definitely stay dependent on the West, and it's not just artillery; it's other things as well.
Yeah, I think this is one of the key vulnerabilities of the Ukrainians. Their supply chain. They're using multiple weapons. They seem to be handling it very well at the moment. But one of the things, and I know we discussed this before, is I worry about weakening Western resolve. Because I think one of the things we see here in this fight, right, is that Russia is not a conventional military threat to Western Europe or even Eastern Europe, perhaps the Baltics, right, given the proximity of the border. And then that invokes Article 5 with NATO, etc. I don't think the Russians want to go there. So I could see at some point, and also the dearth of equipment that the Western countries have, they're increasingly coming up short on what they can supply. The U.S. has really become the main supplier, with the United Kingdom second. So this is just one that I always just keep my eye on. It's one of the biggest concerns, weakening support. How does Ukraine manage its the flow of the weapons coming in, and what happens if there's, as we come up to the potential hard winter in Western and Eastern Europe, can this weaken resolves? Does this cause a push for a negotiated settlement? I realize these are probably a lot bigger issues than than what's happening in the, in the military, on the battlefield here, which is the focus of our talk. But it does bleed down into Ukraine's capabilities if there is a weakening there. Do you have any thoughts on that at this point?
You hit it on the head in that, Western support really is the center of gravity for Ukraine. I think Putin probably knows that, or he should know that, if Ukraine keeps getting the same level of Western support, I don't really see the tides turning for Russia. So, Putin really has to do something about that, or he has to bet that it's going to dry up, whether because the supplies just run out, or if the will, the determination on the West part sort of degrades over time. So I think he's done a number of things to try to deter further Western support, whether energy, blackmail, nuclear threats, what have you. So far it hasn't worked. I'm hopeful that it will continue not to work. But as the months go ahead and as the war drags on, perhaps late into 2023, and we could be looking at potentially winter 2023, a year from now. Who knows? It's really hard to predict that.
That's a difficult projection point. I mean, right now we're seeing 10+% and double-digit inflation. In Germany, they're talking about blackouts, and that has a real impact on democratic countries and their will,
Yeah.
right? We're not. It's theoretically, or however you want to put this, it's not really our fight in the sense, or at least that's the common person's. Once their power starts going out, once they're paying a lot of money, they're going, well, maybe we need to look for a different solution. That's what I worry about. But I think you're right. So far, it hasn't had that impact. This winter is going to be a real test. But let's keep looking at how is Russian force mobilization. How is that projecting going forward? Is it going to work for the Russians? What are they doing? What are the pros? What are the cons here?
I would just add on the last topic that ultimately it'll be up to the U.S. So, and probably increasingly so, at least in terms of military support.
Yeah, and I think the fact that Poland it seems to be more than willing partner, and the Baltics, I think that gives the avenue through. Like I could see what happens if Germany just throws its hands up in the air? Well, it doesn't have a border with Ukraine, so we could always use Poland as a conduit to get U.S. military aid. But then this puts additional pressure, right? There's a political issue there. Again, I realize we're exceeding our scope, but if a lot of Western Europe says, not our fight, we want a negotiated settlement, then the U.S. has to up the cost. American citizens start questioning, well, if this is such a threat to democracy in Europe, why aren't the Europeans concerned about this? So these type of issues kind of snowball over time. Those are my concerns. I hope that I'm, certainly, that I'm, looking at the worst case scenario there, and that it won't play out that way. Let's just say, but I always prepare for the worst.
Yeah, definitely agree. It's something we have to keep an eye on, and obviously the Ukrainians do watch it very closely as well.
Yes, they do. So let's get back to Russian mobilization going forward. Yeah.
Overall, I'd say it's been a bit of a hot mess. I'm sure the listeners have seen this in the social media and elsewhere. Russia mobilization has really overwhelmed their capacity to take in, accommodate, equip, and train up so many forces. As I said in previous podcasts, the Russian army is not the Soviet one. It's not really built to quickly intake and effectively deploy just a vast number of troops like this. So the claim number is 300,000. It's hard to say exactly whether that number is accurate, but it is certainly a lot. I think it's probably in the hundreds of thousands, if not 300. So, Russia, I think even if they had their entire military back in Russia, and they had all their junior officers available to train and lead these folks, which right now is a big problem. I think they'd have some capacity issues. And actually, they had to postpone by a month their planned autumn conscription cycle. So in Russia, you hold two conscription cycles a year, spring and fall. The fall one was supposed to start October 1. They delayed it by a month, basically saying, we don't want to stretch our capacity even further. So you might have seen on social media and elsewhere, videos of folks without body armor or things like that. I'd say that the issues of provision and probably training as well have varied considerably by region. So I wouldn't assume that the issues you see online are really across the board. It probably varies by how wealthy the region is, because a lot of times the MOD stocks, they've basically said, hey, it's on the regional government to procure sleeping bags or medical supplies or whatever. And so the poor regions suffer, and along with them the mobilized troops from there, and then the more wealthy regions do a bit better.
Assuming that corruption isn't playing a key role in preventing some of that gear to getting to the Russian troops too.
I think definitely corruption. We can say this: corruption probably did play a role in depleting some of the stocks to begin with. There was actually a Duma member who asked something along the lines of, where did the 1.5 million uniforms go? So like, why are we having a shortage of uniforms? Why are we getting local women in these regions to sew uniforms by hand or on their sewing machines or whatever? So yeah, I think corruption is probably an issue, and we've actually seen some prosecutions come out for some folks who are responsible for this sort of thing. So I suspect that these problems that might have been swept under the rug are now getting pulled back out from under the rug.
Okay, John, I think we covered everything we can in this episode of discussing the Russia-Ukraine war. You got anything else to add quickly?
I would just say, in the months ahead, I wouldn't count out or discount the effect of mobilization. We're going to have to see, so the Russians have kept the majority of their mobilized forces back in Russia and still undergoing training. At least, that's what they say. And so theoretically, these troops could get more and better training. Whether that's actually going to happen, it remains to be seen. But, I suspect they will try to, maybe reconstitute some units and create reserves. And so if they are successful, that could have a significant impact on the war. As I said earlier, I don't see it really turning into a war winner for Russia, but it could, enable them to sustain it and really affect, how much territory Ukraine is able to take. So we're going to have to watch the quality of training that these forces are getting. That's something I do daily. And I think we'll probably see the effect on the battlefield.
Yeah, I think this is the key point, the key moment for the Russians here. If they're unable to mobilize and train the forces this winter, and they should have time to do this, and then get them deployed, and at the very least hold the ground, I think you're pretty much looking at the end of I think the Russians will be able to hold some territory for this, but its ability to retake and achieve its goals of taking the Donbass and possibly regaining lost areas in Kherson, I think that's out the window. And so the Russians are at a key point with this mobilization. John, thank you very much for joining us today on Generation Jihad. Just a reminder for our listeners, you could find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one. Thanks again, and we'll see you again soon.